Hello and welcome to the Trauma Series Part 3, Creating a Trauma Responsive Court System, presented by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. My name is Dr. Alicia Summers. I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation here at the National Council, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Sean Marsh, the Chief Program Officer of Juvenile Law. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about trauma. Part 3 of the presentation is going to draw on Parts 1 and 2, assuming that you understand the basics of trauma and how it affects youth and what that looks like in practice and the general core conditions of healing. And today we're going to really focus on understanding the factors related to traumatic court experiences, identifying environmental stressors, and describing ways to create core conditions of healing within the juvenile and family courts. Our role is really to help you understand a little bit more about trauma and how you can apply some of the things that we've talked about and create these conditions within your own court systems. We've created a working definition of trauma-responsive courts or trauma-responsive justice here at the National Council. We preliminarily define this as court systems, a system in which environments, practices, policies, and persons limit unnecessary stress and promote healing in those who've been trauma exposed, to include court consumers and court professionals. We're going to talk in a few minutes about why that's really important, but we've noticed in our work across the country, it's not just the court clients that need to have a better understanding of trauma and be able to promote the conditions of healing. In Part 2, we talked about the core conditions, so just as a quick reminder, if it's been a while since you've seen that or if you have not seen it, we talked about 3 essential things for creating the conditions of healing within the courts. Safety. People have to feel safe in order to heal. Self-determination or agency. People need to have a sense of choice and voice within the system. And social connectedness. One of the factors promoting resiliency in youth when they've been exposed to adversity and other childhood traumas is having a person that they can turn to, a positive, caring adult that they trust, that they can come to when they need help. And so creating these social connections are important. And it's also important for adults. We have learned with the research in the field that it's one of the critical elements for children to promote resiliency. But adults also, having that person is helpful to them. So those are our core conditions, and that's going to set the stage for how we're going to conceptualize this in our work within the courts. Starting in 2013, the National Council started doing some work around trauma. We were asked, what does a trauma-informed court look like, or a trauma-responsive court look like? And we didn't have great answers. So we started drawing on the literature. We looked at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and had some conversations and really got out into the field to figure out what this looks like in practice. We started doing what we now call trauma consultations with the courts and have done over 20 to date at various courts all over the country, urban, rural, specialty dockets, to really examine what does it look like and how are the courts promoting these conditions of healing. What we do on site is we examine the environment, the whole court environment, from getting to the doorstep all the way through when we leave. We examine practices, we examine policies, and people from an A to Z process through the lens of safety, agency, and connectedness. So using our framework, we try to examine holistically what court is like. We look for things like trauma triggers, things that are going to be unnecessarily stressful on individuals, how they're going to get to the court, the navigability, getting around, the interaction of stakeholders with each other and parties, and the ability to apply trauma trainings in a meaningful way. One of the things that we've learned from the field is that people get a lot of trainings on trauma, they hear a lot about trauma, they might have been to hours of trainings on trauma, and they really don't know what to do with that information. So we started this process. We've been to a lot of courts, and we are seeing very similar things across the country. We've learned some valuable lessons, and that's one of the things we're going to share with you today. What we're seeing in the courts is that there are clear issues of burnout and turnover, and not just in social service agencies where we see that really highly, but also within court staff and others who are involved in this. The reason we think for that is there's a high level of secondary traumatic stress. Our second bullet here, there's no inoculation training or training on how to recognize and respond to secondary traumatic stress. What we learned from our work is that it's huge in the field. People don't even think about how it's affecting them. The lawyers, the court staff, judges, social workers, anyone who comes into contact with traumatized individuals on a daily basis, anyone who has to read horrific stories of abuse or neglect, might suffer from secondary traumatic stress. And not understanding what that looked like or how it might manifest in an individual is very problematic. When we went across the country and asked people how they're responding, do they know that this is an issue, and do they have resources, our most common answers that we got were no. Very few resources, or lack of a recognition of what might be available, or concern about using it based on how others might perceive that. So there's very little resources that people are engaging in that can actually help reduce the secondary traumatic stress. But they are starting to recognize that this is an issue, but they don't know what it looks like in their staff and others. We also saw some appreciation, but fairly limited, regarding the environmental stress. Coming to court is typically a stressful process. If you think about it, there are very few occasions where you have to go to court where it's a happy time. Maybe if you go there to get your marriage license, but most of the time people are there because they have a parking ticket they need to pay. There's some kind of fine they have to take care of. They're there for jury duty, which there's a lot of non-positive things that people might consider having to go to court. And so the environment itself might be stressful, just walking in the building. If you couple that with the fact that most of these buildings are not designed with the consumer in mind, think about how stressful that might be. Some of these are very institutionalized type buildings. They're very sterile, bare, non-welcoming environments where people might be spending large chunks of their day, large chunks of their time while they're waiting to go see a judge. Those types of things can really make the process more stressful on individuals. We also found, in terms of environment, is the courts are kind of confusing to navigate. Sometimes the signage is only in English despite the population languages. And even if it's in multiple languages, sometimes it's just complex to figure out how to go from walking in the door to the courtroom where you're supposed to be, particularly if you've never been there and you're a little confused. So there's some issues around navigability and some challenges in applying what they've learned. So these are the things that we saw within our court system. We compiled all the different recommendations from our courts and came up with a couple that we want to share that we think are generalizable across the country. To the extent that they apply in your courtroom may be different, but these are the main things that we made as recommendations system-wide. We made recommendations around the persons. Like I said, we reviewed environment, policy, practice, and persons. One of the person definitions is we think it would be helpful for the systems to create a shared definition of trauma. That's because on site, sometimes people look at this very differently. We had one site where a person responded that it could be anything from a stubbed toe, anything that creates that stress response, to another set of stakeholders who said it has to be PTSD for it to be trauma. If you think about that in perspective, these are people who were communicating about a case, working together, and they're looking at this very differently. So creating a shared definition of trauma will help all the stakeholders get on the same page. We also recommend heavily prioritizing secondary traumatic stress. It's important that the stakeholders involved take care of themselves, are able to recognize the signs of secondary traumatic stress within their staff, and have resources available and opportunities to help decompress, de-stress people. So there should be something that can help them when they're experiencing this type of stress. We also strongly recommend soliciting the opinions of community members. When we start talking about environment and practice, it's going to be a little easier to recognize why this might be important. But if your system is set up to serve children and families, then why not ask the children and families if they're getting what they need, what the system is like for them, where they see challenges or barriers, how hard it is for them to get to court, what it's like when they get there. Are they able to find their courtrooms? Getting the opinions of the members of the community that you serve can really help them feel like they're part of the process, but can also give you a different perspective on the court process entirely. We also strongly encourage promoting diversity in court professionals. I think that it sends a powerful message when people from your community come in and the court professionals match the community. And so you're coming into a courtroom, if you're the only female in the entire courthouse and all the attorneys are males and the judge is male and all the security guards are male, what does that say to you? If you create diversity that matches your community, it sends a message that you understand and respect the community and the diversity within. We've also make some recommendations around environment. In fact, we have several recommendations around environment. I think people tend to understand what the environment is like and how much that can affect individuals. Our main recommendations are around promoting safety within the environment, which is one of our critical components to conditions of healing, and creating an environment that conduces or is conducive to limiting physiological arousal. So that's anything that can create that level of stress. And arousal could be because environmental factors like lighting or heat, any of those things can create a physiological response. And if we can keep those low and keep the process more low stress, then it's less likely to trigger someone's trauma. So let's look at these in a little bit more depth. So safety. Some of the things that we've seen, victims need a safe place to sit where they will feel like their perpetrators cannot get to them. So we need a place for victims where they feel safe. What we've seen in the past is a lot of courtrooms just have a waiting area. The victims and perpetrators might all be in the same waiting area, and it's an opportunity for them to feel unsafe. It's also an opportunity for intimidation on the part of the perpetrator, which is problematic for the victim. So it's important to think about how this can be done in context with the resources that you have. And our courts have done this in a variety of different ways, from completely separate waiting areas with a check-in post, to increases in security, to having some people wait in the courtroom and others wait in the waiting area, or just protocols that they put into place where the security has an idea or recognizes people when they come in and is there to help monitor. So there's varying ways to do this, but it's important to have this in place. People need to feel safe coming into the court, within the courtrooms, and in the waiting areas. Think about your security procedures coming into the courtroom. As system professionals, they might be very different from what they might be for your consumers who are coming in off the street. Are your security guards of both genders? What's the process if they set off the metal detector? Do they have a wand? Do they get patted down? What's that like? Now think about that in the context of a victim. What if someone's been sexually abused and they have someone patting them down? How might they respond? What if all your security guards are male and you have a female victim who is coming through and goes through this procedure? How might that trigger some of the prior traumas? So it's important to think about in context what this is like for individuals. Are the security guards making them feel safe as they enter the courthouse? And are there ways to make this more approachable for people or make them feel more safe? What's your security presence like in the waiting areas? Different things like that can really affect the perceptions of safety. And again, going back to the opinions of your community can really help you determine whether people feel safe. The process itself should also not be stressful. The navigability of the court is critical. If people have trouble getting there, there's not public transportation, they can't find the building. On one of our site visits, I Googled the courthouse and my cab took me to a wrong place, and I had to walk a mile to the courthouse after I found it by calling someone and figuring it out. If that's what the clients are going through, that's a stressful process for them, and it's going to be really hard. So the court should be easy to navigate to the extent that you can use clear, appropriate signage so that they can't look at something and say, what is this? Where am I supposed to go? People are going to get frustrated. It's going to increase their stress level. It's already starting them off on the wrong foot. Any ways that we can reduce that is going to help promote the systems of healing. We also want the process not to be stressful in terms of how long they're waiting for their hearings. If they're sitting outside missing an entire day of work because they're waiting for their hearing to happen and then it gets continued, that's going to be stressful and frustrating. It's going to reduce the probability of them coming back to court the next day. If they have to meet with their attorneys out in a crowded waiting area and disclose confidential information in front of others, that can also be very stressful to people. So consider what your environment looks like. Do you have little waiting rooms where attorneys can go to talk with their clients if they're meeting them right before the hearings? What do you have in your space to reduce these factors? We also think that it's important to limit any type of arousal. So the environment should be comfortable to the extent possible. It doesn't need to be set up like your living room with a big comfy overstuffed couch, but it should be something that's not so uncomfortable that people don't want to stay there more than 5 minutes. It should be aesthetically appealing. The dark, dreary, sketchy looking spaces are not really helpful for reducing stress. There should be appropriate lighting and temperature. One of the consultations that we did, the courtroom was beautiful but old. The original courthouse in the community, it was very interesting and lovely on the inside, but did not have a great heating system. We went in the fall/winter time, and I remember there's a public restroom off the courthouse, walking in, and it felt like walking into a freezer. The lady behind me literally walked in the door, said nope, and walked out. Now, while that's probably an extreme example, those things are important. If it's hot because there's no air conditioner or too cold because the heating system's not good, that already gets people stressed out. It increases physiological arousal, which increases their stress and increases the probability of something triggering these traumas and making it less likely that they're going to be able to respond in an appropriate manner when they're in court. So those things are important in limiting arousal. Also think about ways to minimize the noise. If you have bailiffs that yell out the names of the parties in the waiting area, or loudspeakers that are calling out cases, or you have a bunch of hearings scheduled at the same time and your courtrooms waiting areas are very crowded, it might be very noisy, which can also be stressful to individuals. Also think about what your courtroom art says to the consumers. If the art is something that is appealing, child-friendly, that's great. If the art is nice art from local artists, but maybe could stress people out in some way or be considered creepy, it might be nice to think about what we can do with our art to make it more inviting or more friendly. I've seen a lot of courtrooms do this really well, and courthouses do this really well by including child-friendly art or even local children's art in their waiting areas. It sets a stage that this is a place for families to come to court and that you're working within the community. So think about what your art says within your courtroom and if there are ways to make that more appropriate or better for individuals. We've also made recommendations around policy. One of our recommendations is to implement a policy that eliminates presumptive shackling for juveniles appearing in court. This is actually a resolution passed by the National Council. I think it's important and something for the courts to consider. Shackling a juvenile wrist, waist, ankles to walk into a courthouse can be intimidating and scary for the juveniles. If they're not a threat, consider what it might mean for them to not be shackled, to come before court in a way that doesn't make them seem like a safety threat to others. How that could affect their attitudes, their beliefs, and their interactions with the court system and what that can mean. There's more information about that if you're interested on our website. We also have made recommendations around practice. So we've got environment, persons, policy, and practice recommendations for the courts. For practice, we think it's important to match the services to the unique needs of the family. That sends a clear message that the court is there to be responsive to the clients that they serve. We're here to meet your needs. This is not just a checkbox to us. Your needs are important. So matching the services to the needs is critical. Discuss how to implement a trauma screening into current practice. Most courts don't have a trauma screening, and we're not suggesting that the bench ask trauma questions necessarily to the clients that come before them, but I think it's important for judges to meet with their stakeholders and discuss what we do have in place, what screening tools are available, how they're used, and how that might be integrated into practice to really identify the youth who might have experienced trauma and dig a little deeper into what can be done to help promote healing. You can also promote healing through a healing environment through positive interactions with the court. If people feel like they're given a choice in something in the court process, that could be critical for them. Choice is important to people. As we talked about a little in the last video in the core conditions, having that choice back can help reduce those feelings of trauma where choice was taken away. Choice doesn't have to necessarily be, hey, what do you want to do on this case? Choice could be a choice between, would you like to come to court in the morning or the afternoon? Do Tuesdays or Thursdays work better for you? We'd like you to engage in these drug treatment services. Here are some options available in your community. Which of these do you think will work best for you? But giving people an opportunity to voice their opinions, their concerns, and have a choice in their treatment, in the days they come to court, a choice in their case, a choice in their life is really important to promote healing. And finally, we strongly urge the promotion of positive pro-social connections for youth and families. Like I said earlier, this is critical for promoting resilience in the families that we serve. We've learned that just having one person who's there from a trusted adult support person dramatically increases resilience and makes youth much more able to be successful, to identify and learn these coping skills so that they don't have all the negative reactions from being exposed to trauma. So there is something that we can do. Now, I know I just gave you a big list of recommendations, but we have a couple ideas for you about putting some of those into practice. One is through judicial leadership and collaboration. Judges are in a unique position to help co-create this community of healing. They're leaders within the community, and often when the courts have a strong collaboration between all the system stakeholders, the attorneys, social workers, treatment providers, all those involved in the case, it's an ideal opportunity to start talking about what current practice is and how can it be improved. And that's actually one of our recommendations in terms of, if you don't know what to look for in your own practices, we've given you a couple ideas, but it really starts with asking questions. Why do we do certain things? What purpose do they serve? Is it meeting the needs of our clients? Asking these questions of yourselves, but also asking the community members is important to start better understanding how the system's working and how it's perceived by others external to the system. Ensure that staff are trained and on the same page. A lot of times court staff are overlooked in the trauma trainings or secondary trauma trainings where they'll understand the impact, the negative impact on this work. So it's important that they all have a good understanding of this so they can recognize the behavior in their staff, but also talk to people to see if you have the same definitions of trauma. It's a great opportunity to make sure you're using the same language, and when one person says trauma, they mean the same thing as someone else, or at least similar things. Implement universal precautions. And what we mean by this is, instead of taking a victim-offender approach to the work with juvenile delinquents or families involved in the system, what if the work was approached with an assumption that most of the children and families that come before the courts have been hurt in some way, and this is an opportunity to promote healing of whatever that hurt was. If we consider it from a perspective of these individuals might be engaging in this behavior due to their history and context, not taking away accountability for actions, but understanding the nature of the actions and what led them here, is there something that we can do differently in practice to help promote healing so that we don't see these youth in our child abuse and neglect system grow into parents who have kids that are involved in the child abuse and neglect system. If there's a way that we can end the cycle by promoting healing at this point. And then we also consider it really important to practice and model self-care. As we said earlier, the secondary traumatic stress is huge. The work of the professionals working in the juvenile and family court system is very challenging. It's very stressful. There's a lot of really hard and traumatic cases that you're going to hear, see, read about. It's important to make sure that you and your staff and all the other professionals have opportunities for self-care, know how to recognize these signs, and have positive ways to deal with the stress that can help reduce it on an individual and a system level. And then finally, engage persons of character. There's a lot of people in promoting these pro-social connections that might be involved in an individual's life. And this could be for adults or youth involved in the system. Think about the persons, help them to identify persons who could work as support persons for them. Someone that can help drive the kid to visitation, someone who can help the parent with transportation, someone who could just be there as a person for them to talk to or turn to. If we find opportunities to bring in these support persons, we can promote those pro-social connections and help the families really achieve. Because we start on some negative notes talking about the problems with the system, we always like to end on a more positive note.
And now to honor America and salute the men and women serving our country with our national anthem. Please welcome, as voted by you, the fans, our winner of the Toyota Get the Feeling of a Star promotion, Natalie Gilbert.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the starlight star? Starlight, fast gleaming, whose first stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight. Oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red light came through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and our home of liberty.
This is a perfect example of our recommendations to help create those pro-social connections. Here we have a young lady who's given this great opportunity to sing. She starts singing and she stumbles. And we all stumble as human beings. Everyone makes mistakes, has these challenges. She stumbles and she looks to the side for help. She's not quite sure what to do. And she has this adult who comes over and he puts his arm around her and he gets her back on track. He starts giving her the words and says, "It's okay, let's go." And then she's able to finish and she turns around and thanks him. This was a person for her, a person who was there for her when she stumbled, when she had a hard time, that she could turn to, that helped her succeed. I think it's important to recognize that a lot of people take for granted most of us might have that person or a person or multiple persons in our life that can do this. The children and families that come before the court system may not always have that, but the court has a unique opportunity, all the system stakeholders involved in the court, to help identify these support persons and pro-social positive connections for the youth, to help promote resilience, to help reduce some of the negative impacts on trauma, and to help them be able to succeed and be successful in life. Thank you for joining us for the Trauma Series Part 3. If you'd like more information, please check out our website at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Our website is listed here, as is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, who we've been collaborative partners with in a lot of our trauma work. You're also welcome to contact myself or Dr. Summers, or Dr. Marsh, excuse me, with any other follow-up questions that you might have.